A legendary warrior, undefeated and feared by all, thought she was invincible, until a simple human shattered her blade and her pride. What happens when the strongest falls? Stripped of her weapon and her confidence, she must confront a truth more powerful than any sword. True strength lies in understanding, not in victory. Can she rise again? Not as a warrior, but as a woman seeking redemption. Prepare for a journey of self-discovery, where strength is redefined and defeat becomes the path to a new beginning. Watch the transformation unfold, because this isn't just a fight. It's the fight for her soul. Hey, yes, if you love thrilling sci-fi stories with a twist, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below with your thoughts. Let's dive into. The warrior stood tall, a living legend. Her name echoed through every battlefield, carried by the whispers of those who feared her and those who admired her strength. She had defeated countless warriors from every corner of the world, each one falling to her unyielding might. Her blade was said to be forged in the fires of the gods, sharper than any weapon and deadlier than any strike. No warrior, no army, no king could stop her. She was unstoppable. For years, she had traveled the world, seeking challenges, testing herself against the fiercest opponents. One by one, she crushed them. In battle, she moved like a storm, quick and powerful, leaving no room for her enemies to breathe. Her eyes, cold and determined, burned with the fire of victory. No one could match her strength. No one could even come close. She was the greatest fighter to ever live, or so she believed, but in her heart, there was something missing. With every victory, a sense of emptiness grew inside her. She had proven her strength to the world, but it didn't feel like enough. She had no equal, no one left to challenge her. The warriors she had defeated were all the same. Strong, skilled, but ultimately no match for her. She needed something more. She needed the ultimate test, and she found it in the most unlikely of places. Word reached her of a human, just a simple man, they said. He was untrained, weak, and had never held a sword in his life. Yet, he was said to have beaten an entire squad of elite soldiers with nothing but his bare hands. The stories about him seemed too wild to be true, but the warrior was intrigued. Could a human really possess such strength? Could he be the one who could finally give her the challenge she longed for? She doubted it, but the idea gnawed at her. She decided to seek him out. The world laughed at the idea. A mighty warrior like her, seeking a challenge from a mere human? It was absurd. Yet she traveled far and wide, her heart burning with the need to face this man. The moment she arrived at his village, she found herself facing a man who was nothing like the warriors she had fought before. His eyes weren't filled with arrogance or pride. There was no rage, no anger in him. He was calm, almost peaceful, but there was something about him that made her uneasy. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't intimidated by her presence. And that, more than anything else, was what caught her off guard. The villagers watched in silence as the warrior approached him, her sword drawn and ready. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch. He stood there, waiting. She couldn't help but feel the challenge rise in her chest, the thrill of facing someone who wasn't afraid to face her. With a swift movement, she lunged forward, her blade slicing through the air. But the human, with no weapon, did something she hadn't anticipated. He caught her blade. Not in the way one would grab a sword, no, he caught it with his bare hands. In that moment, she felt something shift. For the first time in years, she felt doubt. She didn't know why, but this human, this simple man, made her feel something she had never felt before. Fear. The warrior had no idea that this challenge would be the one to break her. The warrior stood in silence, her eyes locked onto the human before her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel in control. Her blade, a symbol of her power, was caught effortlessly in his hands. She had expected resistance, but not this. His grip was firm, steady, like he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The crowd around them held their breath, unsure of what to make of this strange turn of events. She tried to pull her sword away, but his hold was unyielding. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw no fear, no awe, no trembling. Just calm. That calm, more than anything, unsettled her. He didn't look at her as though she were the mighty warrior that she was. He looked at her like he was seeing something far more dangerous than just a skilled fighter. He saw her as an equal, or worse, someone to be outsmarted, not outmuscled. The warrior had fought kings, generals, and entire armies, but no one had ever looked at her the way this man did. With patience, with understanding. She pushed harder, twisting the blade, trying to break free, but he didn't budge. It wasn't that he was stronger, no, it was that he knew how to move. His every motion was calculated, effortless. She struck again, faster this time, but he anticipated her move, stepping aside just as her blade sliced through the air where his head had been seconds before. She was growing frustrated. How could this human, this mere man, move with such skill? She had fought warriors who had trained their whole lives for combat, and yet here he was, dodging and weaving with a grace that seemed to defy everything she knew about fighting. This wasn't strength, not brute force. This was something else. Something she didn't understand. He didn't attack. He didn't try to overpower her. Instead, he moved with her. Every strike she made, every move she took, he was one step ahead. It was as though he had been waiting for her, anticipating her every action. She was the one who was being controlled now. The crowd began to murmur, whispers of disbelief and awe. No one had ever seen a warrior like her falter. She was supposed to be invincible. She had made legends of herself by defeating every opponent in her path, but this human, he was different. And that thought, more than anything else, terrified her. The warrior paused, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. She wasn't used to being challenged, let alone by someone who wasn't even armed. And yet here she was, struggling to keep up. There was no arrogance in his movements, no showmanship. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply surviving. For the first time, the warrior felt her pride slip away. The blade, once an extension of her strength, now felt like a burden. She had always relied on it to defeat her enemies, but this human had shown her that strength wasn't just about weapons or power. It was about something deeper, something she had been ignoring for too long, and then, in a moment of stillness, it happened. The human reached out, grabbed her sword with a single hand, and twisted it from her grasp. It wasn't a violent motion. It wasn't a fight. It was a surrender. The blade fell to the ground with a dull thud, and the warrior stood there, frozen. In that instant, she knew. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about understanding. And for the first time in her life, she understood that her strength wasn't enough. Not against this human. Not against this force she couldn't see, couldn't understand. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the warrior stood, her blade gone, her pride shattered. The human had not defeated her with power. He had defeated her with patience, with understanding, and in doing so, had shown her the greatest lesson she would ever learn. The warrior stood motionless, her hands trembling, not from exhaustion, but from something far more unfamiliar, humility. For a brief moment, the world around her faded. The cheers and gasps of the crowd blurred, leaving only the quiet echo of her own breathing. She had been defeated, not by brute strength, but by a simple, undeniable truth. She was no longer the greatest. The human had caught her blade, and in doing so, he had caught her pride. He stood before her, calm and collected, his expression unreadable. The blade, which had once felt like an extension of herself, now lay discarded at her feet. She had no weapon, no defense. It wasn't just a loss in battle. It was a loss of everything she had ever believed in. The warrior who had conquered entire armies, who had never feared a challenge, was now vulnerable, exposed. But what truly stung was the look in his eyes. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't mockery, it was understanding. He wasn't proud of what he had done, nor did he gloat over her defeat. He simply looked at her as though he saw something in her that she couldn't see in herself. Something deeper, something far more human. The warrior wanted to fight, wanted to strike back, but there was no fight left in her. She was broken, not by the human's actions, but by the realization that her entire life had been built on false notions of strength and invincibility. She had been so certain that her power was all that mattered, that if she defeated enough warriors, she would remain untouchable. But in this moment, standing before the one person who had outsmarted her, she understood. True strength was not just about defeating others, it was about knowing when to yield, when to learn, when to accept defeat. The human spoke then, his voice steady and calm. "Power isn't everything," he said, his words simple yet profound. "What you've learned from your battles, the victories you've claimed, they've made you strong, but they've also made you blind. Blind to the truth that strength alone can never make you invincible." She looked at him, unsure of how to respond. She had been taught that weakness was a thing to be feared, that surrender was a disgrace. But now, faced with the most humbling experience of her life, she began to question everything. What had all her victories meant if they had led her to this moment? Was this human right? Had she been so focused on becoming the strongest that she had missed the lessons hidden in her failures? The crowd continued to watch, waiting for her reaction, but she had no answer. She had never been asked to confront herself before. The warrior who had prided herself on her invincibility now found herself in the deepest battle she had ever faced, the battle for self-understanding. Her gaze shifted to the shattered remains of her blade. The weapon that had made her feared, that had made her invincible in the eyes of others, was now nothing more than broken pieces scattered across the ground. And for the first time, the warrior didn't feel anger. She didn't feel shame. She felt something far more powerful, hope. Hope that this defeat, this moment of weakness, could be the beginning of something greater than all the victories she had ever claimed. The human turned to leave, offering her one final glance. "You'll find your strength again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it won't be in your blade. It will be in you." With that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving the warrior standing alone, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and realization. She had been defeated, but in her defeat, she had found a chance for something more. And as she stood there, the weight of her past victories heavy on her shoulders, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The warrior spent days wandering through the wilderness, the weight of her defeat pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible chain. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between her past glory and the unsettling lessons she had learned. The shattered remnants of her blade still haunted her every step. She had never known a life without it, never questioned its power. But now, in its absence, she was forced to confront herself in a way she had never imagined. Her pride, once her greatest weapon, had become her prison. She had spent so many years convincing herself that strength was all that mattered. That to be the best meant conquering everything in her path. That a victory was the only measure of worth. But in the silence of the forest, away from the praise and the crowds, she began to understand that power alone had never been enough. It had never filled the emptiness inside her. Her nights were restless. The images of the human's calm, unflinching gaze kept returning to her mind. He had not defeated her with force. He had broken her by seeing her for who she truly was, not the legend she had built for herself. It was as though he had peeled away the layers of armor she had so carefully constructed, exposing the vulnerability beneath. And for the first time, she didn't know who she was without her reputation, without the image of invincibility she had clung to for so long. She found herself reflecting on every battle, every opponent she had ever faced. How many had fallen before her, not because of their weakness, but because of her refusal to see beyond the fight? How many times had she won, only to walk away, leaving the wreckage behind her? In the pursuit of victory, she had lost sight of what truly mattered, the connections with those she fought beside, the respect she could have earned by understanding her enemies, rather than simply destroying them. The warrior realized that in her quest to be the strongest, she had neglected the very essence of what made someone powerful, the ability to grow, to change, and to learn from failure. Her defeat had cracked the foundation of her arrogance, and what remained was a raw truth she could no longer ignore. She was not invincible. She was human. The days passed, and as she walked deeper into the forest, something began to shift within her. She knew she had to return to the village where the human lived. She didn't know what she was seeking. Perhaps redemption, perhaps understanding, or maybe just the courage to face the one who had shattered her pride. But the journey was no longer about reclaiming her strength. It was about discovering a new path, one that didn't rely on her blade or her reputation, but on something far more enduring: inner strength. The warrior had spent so long in the shadows of her own expectations, believing that she was only as good as her victories. But now, in the silence of the woods, she began to see the truth that had eluded her for so long. Strength wasn't just about conquering others, it was about conquering oneself. And perhaps, just perhaps, this journey of self-discovery was the true battle she had been waiting for all along. With a renewed sense of purpose, she set her sights on the village, not as a conqueror, but as someone seeking to rebuild, to learn, and to grow. The warrior was no longer defined by the blade she carried or the victories she claimed. She was defined by her ability to change, to rise from the ashes of her past, and to find a new strength within herself. It was a strength she had never known, but one that now she was ready to embrace. The warrior's return to the village was not one of triumph, but of quiet determination. She walked through the familiar paths with her head lowered, her once proud gaze now softened by the humility she had learned over the past few weeks. The villagers, who had once feared her, now looked at her with curiosity and caution. She was no longer the invincible fighter who had defeated their best warriors. She was just a woman, lost in search of something deeper than victory. The human she had challenged was there, in the same place he had been before. He was sitting by a fire, his presence calm and unassuming, as if nothing had changed. He looked up as she approached, his eyes betraying no surprise. It was as though he had known she would come, that her journey was inevitable. The warrior stood before him, uncertain of what to say, unsure of what she even wanted from this encounter. She had come seeking answers, but now, faced with the very person who had broken her, she realized that the question wasn't what he could teach her, but what she could learn from herself. Her hands, once so skilled with a blade, now fidgeted nervously. She had never been in a position like this before. She began, her voice hoarse. You shattered my blade, my pride. The human nodded slowly, not speaking, but understanding. His silence spoke volumes more than any words could. It was as if he had expected her to come to this realization on her own, without him pushing or guiding her. The warrior had always sought victory over others, but now she sought understanding. Understanding not just of the human before her, but of herself. I had to learn something I wasn't ready to face, she said, her words heavier than the silence that followed. I thought strength meant power. That power meant invincibility, but I was wrong. The human's expression softened, and for the first time, the warrior saw not just the calm of a fighter, but the wisdom of someone who had lived beyond the need for dominance. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone conveyed more than any lecture could. The warrior knelt, the earth beneath her feeling different than it ever had before. The weight of her past victories no longer held the same allure. She didn't need to stand above others to prove herself. The battles she had fought, the lives she had changed, now seemed distant and hollow. It wasn't that they hadn't mattered. It was that they had mattered in the wrong way. I thought I could never be defeated, she confessed, the words carrying the weight of all the battles she had fought. But the truth is, I was always defeated by my own pride. And now, I don't know who I am without it. The human finally spoke, his voice steady and clear. You don't have to be defined by your victories or your defeats. You are who you choose to be, in every moment. The strongest warriors are those who know when to fight and when to let go. For a long moment, the warrior sat in silence, the truth of his words settling deep within her. She had always thought that to let go was a weakness, but now she saw it differently. Letting go wasn't about surrendering. It was about evolving, about finding strength in vulnerability and peace in acceptance. When she finally stood, it was not to challenge the human or to reclaim her former glory. It was to walk a new path, one that didn't rely on a weapon but on the strength of her own heart. The blade might have been shattered, but in its place, something far more enduring had emerged. It was not the end of the warrior, but the beginning of her true journey. The warrior walked away, not as a conqueror, but as a student of life, ready to face whatever came next with a strength that could never be broken. The warrior's steps were slower now, more deliberate, as she moved through the village once again. It had been days since her conversation with the human, yet the lessons she had learned were still settling deep inside her. She had left the blade behind, but the real battle had just begun. It was no longer about conquering others. It was about confronting her own mind, her own pride, and most of all, her place in a world that no longer seemed to need the invincible warrior she had once been. She had tried to keep her distance from the villagers, unsure of how they would react to her change. But something in the way they looked at her had shifted. They no longer saw a mighty warrior who demanded respect. They saw a woman, someone who had humbled herself, someone who had begun to understand the meaning of strength beyond power. Slowly, the villagers began to treat her differently. They offered her food, helped her with tasks, and greeted her with respect, not because of her might, but because of her willingness to learn, to change. But even more than the villagers, it was the human who had begun to occupy her thoughts. She had expected to feel resentment toward him, anger for exposing her weaknesses, but instead, she felt a strange sense of gratitude. It was he who had shown her the path she had been blind to for so long. Without his challenge, without his quiet wisdom, she would never have understood the true meaning of strength. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more for her to learn, that her journey was far from over. Each day she worked harder to rebuild herself, but there was still an emptiness within her, a longing for something she couldn't quite define. She had given up her blade, but her hands still ached for it. She had abandoned the warrior's path, but she wasn't sure what path she was walking now. One evening, she sat by the fire, her thoughts clouded with confusion. She had faced many battles, but the hardest one had always been within herself. The human's words echoed in her mind. The strongest warriors are those who know when to fight and when to let go. She had let go of her blade, but was she letting go of her identity too? Just as the fire crackled before her, she heard a voice behind her. It was the human again, standing in the shadows of the trees. She looked up, startled but not afraid. "I see you've been thinking," he said, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "But don't worry too much about what comes next. Sometimes the path isn't about knowing where it leads. It's about taking the first step." For a long moment, she stared at him, a small spark of understanding flickering within her. Perhaps she didn't need to have all the answers right away. Perhaps the journey was enough. The warrior stood, her heart lighter than it had been in years, and took that first step forward, not as a warrior, but as someone ready to discover who she truly was. The warrior walked deeper into the forest, the path now familiar in its unfamiliarity. Her steps were slower, not because she lacked strength, but because she had learned to appreciate the stillness between each step. The world around her had become less of a battlefield and more of a place for reflection. The trees, the breeze, the distant sounds of the river, everything seemed to whisper the same message. She was no longer the person she had once been, and that was okay. Her mind wandered back to the many faces she had seen throughout her journey. She had once viewed every face as an opponent, a challenge to be conquered. She had trained herself to see the world as a series of victories or failures, with nothing in between. But now she saw something different. Each person she had encountered, even the ones who had fallen before her, had been part of her story. They had played roles in shaping who she was, who she had become. It wasn't the victories that had defined her, but the choices she made along the way. Choosing to fight, choosing to understand, and now choosing to grow. And that was something far more powerful than any sword or blade could ever offer. The warrior had learned that true strength was not found in how many battles one won, but in the capacity to learn from the battles one fought. She thought of the human, the one who had shattered her pride, and with it, her identity as a warrior. He had shown her what it meant to be truly strong, not in terms of physical power, but in mental resilience. The human had not needed a weapon to defeat her. He had needed only his mind, his patience, and his understanding. In doing so, he had given her a gift far greater than victory. He had given her the opportunity to rebuild herself, not from a place of arrogance, but from humility. Her journey wasn't over. It could never be. But it was no longer a journey driven by the need to prove herself to others, or to defend an identity that had been shattered. It was a journey driven by the desire to understand herself, to see her flaws not as weaknesses, but as opportunities for growth. The warrior stopped at the edge of a clearing, the sun beginning to set behind the mountains. She stood there for a long time, watching the light fade, not feeling the need to rush, not feeling the need to prove anything. For the first time in her life, she was simply present, simply herself. And in that moment, she realized something profound. The warrior she had once been had died. But in her place stood something far more powerful. A woman who knew her strength was not in her blade, but in her ability to adapt, to learn, and to embrace the unknown. The warrior took one final breath, the cool evening air filling her lungs, and continued walking into the unknown. Not as a warrior, but as someone free.